So endpoint protection and endpoint security in general can be really a lesson in defense in depth. And so the endpoint, when we talk about endpoint in this case, it's typically a user's device. In this case, we'll say a laptop. And that laptop obviously is connected to the organizational network. And so you want to take into consideration, first of all, access. And that comes down to authentication and authorization. When we talk about access, we're talking about authorization, but you also want to make sure that you know that the identity of this user that's accessing that endpoint is authorized, they're authenticated and authorized to use that device. And not only that, but that user context needs to follow throughout the organization's network. So we can start out, again, this is going to be a lesson in defense in depth, but for the authentication aspect, we want to make sure that we include something like MFA, multi-factor authentication, to ensure that that there's multiple steps for a user to gain access to especially sensitive areas of the network. If that device has access to servers and databases within the network, we want to make sure that that access is properly monitored. And we also want to make sure that, certain, especially in cases where if we're talking about like a production environment or like a live environment, that there's proper segmentation between, let's say, the prod environment versus a non-prod environment. That really should be segmented, and the level of access required for the endpoint to access non-prod versus prod should be different, where the prod access should be a step-up type of authentication, maybe actually a challenge again for an MFA. Another point here is email. And when we talk about endpoint protection, we want to make sure that the email, that there's filtering involved that ensures that the email, number one, doesn't contain any kind of malicious links or attachments, and be allowed to go to the user. There's no phishing or things like that. The other thing to consider here when it comes to how a user can access certain parts of the data, especially in a as it relates to the database, is ensure that you have classification. So you want to classify that data so that you know, again, is this user authorized to access the data that's in that database? And it could be that sensitive data is only allowed for certain roles or certain parts of the organization, and we need to confirm whether that user actually has that appropriate level of access. Something else to consider here, if this is a developer, let's say, and they are developing code, we want to make sure that we have a secure SDLC. And secure SDLC means, and we're going to talk more about this as we go forward, but a secure SDLC is ensuring that the code that is being generated and sent to a production environment is free from vulnerabilities, free from influence from external actors, that the supply chain security is in place in terms of open source software. But when it comes to the user, we want to make sure that that pipeline, and when we develop code, we put code into a pipeline and code and a finished product comes out the other end. This pipeline needs to have security in place as well. And that comes down to ensuring that, again, the user has the right controls on their laptop or their device, wherever their development environment is, in terms of how that code gets developed and pushed into the pipeline and eventually into a production environment. So there's a lot of different ways that we can implement a defense in depth style of defense around an endpoint, but it really comes down to a couple primary points here. Make sure that we have the right identity, that identity has the right access available to it, and that we are protecting that endpoint that the user is working in to ensure things like, especially if we're developing code, that's free from any kind of vulnerabilities or influence, and that the access that this individual has carries on to the environments that they go into.